Welcome everyone, people making their virtual way in. Get yourselves comfortable. Very warm welcome to this evening's event, which is Should Brighton Trial a Universal Basic Income? My name is Michael Pugh. I am the director and co-founder of the Basic Income Conversation, which is a part of the think tank Compass. But this evening's event, and I'll be the kind of chair and the host this evening, but this event is put on by Basic Income Southeast, a group of grassroots activists and councillors and academics in the Southeast region who are pushing the idea of basic income in their region, which is supported by the group Basic Income UK. We are here because a petition has been going around Brighton for the last few months. Some of you will have signed it already, and if you haven't, there's an opportunity, you still can. And that petition has been calling on Brighton and Hove Council to trial universal basic income. Almost 2,000 people have now signed that petition. And the kind of momentum in the city and the area has really grown around the idea of piloting in recent weeks and months. And of course, Brighton's not on its own. Right? There's a wider movement that's now growing right across the UK, even before the pandemic struck, but particularly since March. This realisation of this crisis, meaning that the need for basic income has become ever more clear. And so we've seen lots of local authorities right across the country. I believe it's 5 in England, 3 in Northern Ireland, and that's in addition to the 4 local authorities in Scotland who have committed to exploring pilots around this. So all of those have passed motions in recent months and years expressing an interest in piloting. So Brighton, the petition calls for Brighton to become lucky number 13. And that may or may not happen next week. So there's going to be a vote next week at Brighton Hove Council around that idea of a motion. Martin Osborne, who is the Green Party councillor in Brighton, representing the ward of Hollingdean and Stanmer. He's also the deputy chair of Planning, Housing, Licensing Committee, and he's actually the one tabling that motion at the full council meeting next week, which will be happening this time next week. So it's good to have Martin here. We'll hear from him about why he's tabling that motion. Maggie is another one of our speakers this evening. Maggie Gordon-Walker, she's the co-director and founder of the charity Livestock that runs community projects right across Brighton and Hove, specifically Mothers Uncovered, which offers peer support to mothers, and Soul Food, which runs food projects for and with disadvantaged communities. And she, along with Richard and Martin, were one of the co-founders of Basic Income Southeast, and it was Maggie that started the petition. So we're going to hear from Maggie about why she started it, and Martin about why he tabled it. And then we're really lucky to be joined this evening by Dr. Neil Howard. He's an academic at the University of Bath. His research focuses on unfree labour and thinking about how universal basic income links to ideas of freedom and modern slavery. He joins us this evening from Pakistan, where he's currently working on a number of pilots in that region around basic income, and he's really one of the UK's experts on basic income and how it might work, and specifically how we might go about piloting it. So we're going to hear, in terms of the agenda this evening, we're going to hear from Maggie, Martin and Neil for some 3 to 5 minute introductory reflections from them. And then we get into debate, and that's a chance for you on the call this evening and on Facebook to ask questions of our panelists, or put out some of your views about why we should or shouldn't pilot this in Brighton, or if you've got any questions about how that might work. So that's the opportunity tonight to ask those things before the vote happens next week. A bit of housekeeping: those who are on the Zoom, please keep yourselves on mute throughout, and if you do want to ask a question, you can put that in the chat box, which is going to be very ably looked at through Richard and Joe, who will be kind of guiding people through along the chat, putting in links and drawing out some of the best questions that we can ask. Obviously, we might not be able to get to everybody's questions this evening. We're going to try, but we'll see how we get on with that. A reminder that we are recording and we are being streamed live on Facebook this evening, so very warm welcome to everyone tuning in, and particularly those who are tuning back into this, watching this back on YouTube. This is going to be put up shortly after, and so thanks for watching this back. So that's enough of my voice. I think it's now time that we hear the case for why we should have a basic income trial in Brighton. So Maggie, I'm going to come to you first and tell us a little bit about yourself and why you'd like to see a pilot in Brighton. Over to you.
Sure. So yeah, as Mike said, I run livestock in Brighton and Hove. So we've been working with disadvantaged people for sort of 12, 13 years now. And one of the things that struck me particularly is so many people that attend our groups and activities, they're struggling for cash all the time, and it's a source of great anxiety for them. How can they live their lives in a fruitful and rewarding way? Particularly the mums I work with, they often get asked, when are you going back to work? As if somehow looking after their babies is not work. But it's a real source of anxiety. It sort of impinges on their mental and emotional well-being. And they're struggling to make ends meet because they've taken a cut in income if they're looking after their children. They're not wealthy people, the people who come to our groups. They're struggling to make ends meet, to pay the rent. Brighton is seen as being a very affluent city, which it is, but there's areas of real deprivation as well. And even, I think, across the board, most people are feeling the pinch all the time. Money is a constant source of anxiety for them. And you think, well, what is the point of living if you don't have the sort of security to enjoy life and find it fulfilling? So I attended an event about a year ago. It's called the People's Parliament, which is where I first heard about the idea of basic income, and got in touch with Richard and Martin, who said they were forming this group. So that just kind of crystallized the idea for me, the idea that everybody should have the means to live. It shouldn't just be very rich people and everyone else scrabbling around to scratch a living. We should all be able to enjoy our lives. I stopped, Mike. You weren't expecting that. Do you want to?
No, I was not expecting that, but that's wonderful. I thought we were going to slightly go on for longer than that.
I can go on for longer.
No, there's going to be plenty of time this evening to hear from you, Maggie, and we'll come back to you for sure. I want to now, if you have any questions for Maggie or for any of the panelists this evening, do put them in the chat. We won't come to them immediately, but you can start putting them in there now. But now, so if Maggie's kind of told us a little bit about where this idea has come from in her mind and why she set up the petition, that's where you come in, Martin, so in terms of tabling the motion. So Martin, over to you in terms of your reflections on basic income and why Brighton and why now.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And yeah, it's certainly a very important question and a very timely question, I think, with all of the insecurity, and certainly it's been made worse by the COVID pandemic. And yeah, I'm looking forward to debating it next week at the full council, when hopefully we'll be able to get the support from all the parties. And that's on the public petition that we've got, which, as you said, was nearly had 2,000 signatures. And I think that does indicate that there is a lot of strong support for the idea in the city. And I'm just wondering about, sort of thought about why this might be the case. And actually, it's the only place in the UK that we know of so far that has had a public petition that's been able to reach the threshold that councils have for debating petitions. Because all councils around the UK, they do have sites where you can go on and you can lodge petitions on various different ideas, but they often don't debate until you've got that threshold. So in Brighton, it was 1,250. So that was our aim. And within the first month of launching the petition, we were able to get to that 1,250. And over the last few months, we've been able to continue campaigning, and now we're up to almost 2,000. So I just thought about why Brighton might be sort of an ideal place for a universal basic income, and just some of my ideas. There's quite a strong private rented sector in the city, so it's creeping up to around about 40% of all households, and there's particularly high rents. So in Brighton and Hove, it's one of the highest places for rents outside of London, and what that does is that puts people into insecurity, because housing costs make up a large percentage of their income, and so they don't have a lot of spare money to go around. But also people are in lots of precarious work. So there's people like sort of cafe workers, restaurant workers, but also seasonal workers because of the tourist sector. And so those people are sort of both precarious work, 0-hour contracts, possibly not having the greater working standards, and also not having the protections of like sick pay. And then they're also often living in the rented sector, so insecurity and precarity there. But there's also quite a big self-employed and freelance sector, so people working in their own homes, doing their own things, and it's got quite an innovative streak as well, with a lot of the sort of startups and technology sectors having quite a big influence in the city, and lots of co-working spaces that are emerging. So there's lots of people who are doing different ways of working, and I think basic income does feed into that, about facilitating a way of different people to work. So I think the idea that they would support the basic income would be so that they can continue to be entrepreneurial and driving change and growth in the city. But then finally, I thought that there's a bit of a radical streak in politics in Brighton and Hove. We're electing the first Green MP and the first Green administration in the country, but also there's a sort of 2 Labour and 1 Green MP, and across the whole southeast there's very few. It's mainly Conservative, but there's a sort of sea of green and red right on the coast here. So there's that radical sort of streak, and also emphasis on social justice at its heart, with also a large community and voluntary sector as well, supporting with many charities in the city that do a lot of work just the same. So Maggie's just one person, but there's many other people who have contacted us and who are also supporting the idea of making sure that people have that platform, that economic security, which then enables them to live life in the way that they should be entitled to. So that's, I think, sort of a basis of why I think Brighton and Hove is a great place for a trial. And I think all of these different parts, they all work together, they all fit into it a bit like a jigsaw. And also there's a bit like a multiplier effect when you've got all the sort of renters and self-employed, freelancers, people in precarious work, and that radical political streak. I think it works to amplify each other, and there's interdependencies there. So then I think a universal basic income could be a trial in Brighton and Hove could be a perfect place. So I think that's probably what I'd like to start with, and I can come back on later on more general reasons why I think that basic income can be such a sort of revolutionary and transformative idea. But I also would like to point out that Brighton and Hove could be a sort of a perfect place for basic income trial, but I also think it's important to have trials in places which are probably not as ideal, and then you can get a full reflection of how it represents the full country. So yeah, I'll leave it with that for now.
Thank you so much, Martin. Really useful to hear your perspectives on that. And again, if you've got questions for Martin or Maggie on some of the things that they've already begun to raise, do put them in the chat, and then we'll come back to those questions afterwards. But before we get into some of that, I want to introduce Dr. Neil Howard. I hope you're there, Neil. Are you there, Neil? Where are you?
Hello.
Hello, there we are. Fantastic. Yeah, so welcome, Neil. Please share a little bit. You've obviously got some experience talking with pilots. So if you could share a little bit about that and kind of your broad reflections on basic income and why you think somewhere like Brighton would work really well. So over to you.
Thank you, mate. Oh wow, I've just noticed that because this thing is going out on live, what it means is that on my screen there's just my face. And I don't know if any of you ever just sat there talking to your own face, but it's terribly disorienting. So I'm going to try to not look at my face and attempt to look at some of your faces instead. Yeah, so I mean, I'm a basic income fan, so to speak. I am attracted to the idea as one that has potential to basically be emancipatory. And I am a Brighton resident, so it's particularly attractive to me that we might try the policy and assess its potential there. But like, I'm a social scientist, right? So as a researcher, my job is definitely to advocate for things, but also to be skeptical about them. And so the question really is, what do we know based on the trials that have taken place, and there have been a number around the world, and what don't we know? I'll speak specifically about the kind of human dimension of what the data tell us so far, because that's what my research focuses on specifically. And it's pretty simple. What we know from the trials that have taken place, principally in the global south, there's some very, very good data that's come out of India. There's some important data coming out of Southern Africa. And there is also important data that's come out of places like Finland and indeed the US. And what we know at a human level is a number of things. One, basically people experience more dignity as a result of being recipients of a basic income. The kind of shame and stigma that attaches to traditional welfare or benefit systems is basically washed away, largely because these are conditional and kind of give people the message that they don't deserve. And a basic income is, in principle, given to everybody simply by virtue of being a human. So there's this element of mattering ultimately, and that leads to a kind of a stake in the social system, if you like. People see the system as, or experience the system as, potentially working better for them. Likewise, people are able to do more things, right? One of the big critiques of basic income is that it will disincentivize work. The data so far don't show this. People continue to work. Sometimes they're even more productive. Likewise, they continue to collaborate. So there's a whole bunch at the human level, as I say, that is particularly attractive. But there's also a whole bunch that we don't really know. And there's a bunch that we need to know more of if we are going to be able to, I think, successfully advocate for this as a policy to be adopted at a large scale. Things in relation to context, for example. As I say, there hasn't been a huge amount of data developed in Western contexts. Likewise, there hasn't been a huge amount of data gathered recently. So with the changes that our economies and societies have undergone over the last 20 to 30 years, we have kind of plausible suppositions that we can make, but there's not really a huge amount of clear evidence that says, well, this is how a basic income could help, would help, does help with precarious work, for example. So at the same time, like, we exist in a world in which loads and loads of trials are proposed. This is a conversation that is taking place in a number of countries. And of course, one of the major critiques is, look, it's not necessary. We've got enough data. It kind of works. It kind of doesn't. Is this really where we want to go? So I want to just sort of summarize a couple of pieces that I think are particularly relevant to whether or not Brighton and Hove should be pushing forward with a trial, what kind of like particularly added value pieces there are. One is COVID recovery, right? The simple reality is that the current pandemic has been, as was emphasized before, pretty devastating for people, and not obviously just physically in terms of health, but socioeconomically. We know from related research on cash transfers as an emergency response that cash matters. If you put cash in people's pockets in emergency situations, they're more likely to be able to recover quickly and effectively. And so I think as a potential recovery policy, there's a very strong incentive for pushing forward with this as a trial, and indeed in this place. I think that also relates to precarious work and service work. There are plenty of freelancers in Brighton and Hove, and there's, as is the case everywhere around the country, a lot of service work. These folks have been hit very, very hard by the present pandemic, but they've been facing real economic difficulties now for obviously quite some time, and increasingly over recent years. The sort of philosophical idea behind a basic income is that people will have this safety, this not even a safety net, a solid floor to stand on, as opposed to a net that they can fall through in the midst of challenging economic circumstances and when they can't get secure or better work. So in a context like Brighton, where so many such workers exist, again, there's a particular scientific incentive. One of the pieces that I think is especially interesting here is the question around social engagement. So one of the common critiques of basic income as an idea, including by people who look at the data, is that because it's an individual policy, like one of you gets it, the other person gets it, the other person gets it, one of its consequences may be individualization, like a fracturing of society and an undermining of collective action, of community solidarity. I think intuitively that that's a load of rubbish, and the kind of potential for solidarity has been made very, very clear in the way that communities up and down the land have responded to the pandemic. But there's also in the data that exists hints that actually basic income, particularly when accompanied by the options for collective action, can foster greater solidarity and greater mutuality among communities. Brighton, obviously, as we know, is a famously progressive place. And for this reason, I think it would be a particularly useful place to explore whether or not a basic income as an individual grant is indeed something that detracts from or indeed contributes towards people being able to act collectively in their collective interests. For example, by organising, for example, by, I don't know, planting a community garden, whatever it may be. The last piece I'll say, I could bang on for ages, but I don't want to, partly simply to not fall into the stereotype of a researcher. Just to emphasise and echo what Martin said, I think it matters that Brighton has this, this progressive history, this progressive character, that the People's Republic is currently red and green. And I think that does position the city and the surrounds as a potential leader in taking this forward. And although there are many, many proposals for pilots, currently we haven't got any. And indeed, councils haven't passed motions that are going to lead to them imminently. So for me, yeah, Brighton is an important and fitting choice as a sort of leader, if you like, in gathering the data that I think we're going to need to convince the politicians that this is, or indeed isn't, a worthy policy step forward. I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to any questions from any folks. So.
Thank you very much, Neil. Very comprehensive stuff there, and we'll get into. There's already some questions starting to come through in the chat there. Please do keep them coming if you've got any questions for Neil, Martin, or Maggie. But I wanted to kind of pick up on a point that Neil, you just kind of made there. You pointed to some of the pilots so far have largely been in the global south. Some of the kind of data that we've received, although there are some. There was a famous pilot in Finland recently which released its results, and there are a number of cities in the US and Canada now exploring it. But like, kind of, do you feel like one of the, like, why the UK, before we get onto Brighton, there is a question sometimes, isn't there, of like, why do we need to pilot? We've got all this data from around the world. Why in the UK do you feel like we need a pilot? Is there a relevance there that we, either the UK government or the public here, need to see a pilot here for some reason? What do you think, Neil? And then I'll come to Martin or Maggie on that question. Oh, we'll go. Neil, you can't speak right now. Martin, why the UK?
I think Neil was just trying to unmute himself, but yeah, I think that the UK, it's more to do with just people like to see things in their own particular places, their own homes, their own country. People have a sort of, not an exceptionalism, but they always think that their country is a bit unique. And it's true, there is a unique history, there's different perspectives, there's different demographics, different types of economy, different people working in different sectors. So, so there's a whole different mix of different dynamics and variables there that I think people will always want to see it work in their own economy and their own society, first of all. So I think a trial in the UK could be able to prove that it does work in our economy, even though it has been proved in for example, in Finland. People will argue that Finland is different and maybe a smaller number of people, smaller population, maybe, larger land, etc., different tax base. So yeah, that's why I would think that there needs to be one in the UK. But it's also just to have something which the public can get behind, that they can look at, and they can. It's a chance for campaigners to use as almost like a hook, which they can get people interested on the idea. It's about raising public awareness about trials, as well as proving the feasibility that they do work. But you can go back to Neil now once he's unmuted.
Thank you.
Yeah, go on, Neil.
I agree entirely. Agree with everything that Martin has just said. I mean, I mean, there are many ways that you can respond to this. Like, firstly, like, we just need evidence, we need data. As I say, there have been a number of trials, including close to home, as in Finland, but the numbers are still relatively limited. At the same time, the data is pretty compelling if you're a politician that is willing to be compelled. But I think it's relatively obvious that we have a political class that isn't terribly data responsive, let's say, or at least not to the kinds of data that are provided by serious social scientists and other researchers. So that means that for me, there's a political imperative for people that want to advocate for more progressive or different forms of social safety nets, of welfare policy, to be able to get behind data and a story around that data to advocate ultimately for the world that we would like to see. And as Martin mentioned, the close to homeness piece really, really matters. Even if Finland is sort of just across the water around the corner, it's still far enough away from most people's consciousness that it's unlikely to, and indeed hasn't generated the kind of political waves that something taking place on the British Isles would do. So that's kind of the fundamental piece. And again, to echo Martin, there are sort of specificities in the local economy, specificities in the national economy, specificities in the welfare structure, as well as the social structure, that mean that the case will be strengthened if indeed the data suggests that it should be, by drawing on information that is at home. One last piece I'll add, though, is that I really genuinely think that, particularly as people who are intrigued by basic income or who are advocates of basic income or the kind of principles beneath it, it's important that an open mind be kept around what the data may or may not show. Right? So far, the data suggests that it's likely to be a very positive policy for people who receive. But there's still massive amounts we don't know. What happens, for example, to migrant populations who, by virtue of their citizenship status, may not receive a basic income? Are they going to become even more of an underclass that is sort of forced into the darker reaches of the economy as more and more people can say no? Really, we need data at a relatively large scale. Ideally, a citywide pilot would be the kind of thing that might be able to provide it, to be able to respond to these questions. These are sort of progressive gaps, if you like, or gaps within progressive thinking that we don't actually have answers to, and we aren't going to have answers to unless we get the data from trials such as this. So I think there's that skepticism, if you like, is worth holding on to, even for those who are very, very attracted in principle to the idea, including myself and no doubt many of you.
Thank you. I think that kind of really helps us understand, you know, why do we need to pilot? Because that is sometimes a question. Why can't we just crack on and get the government to do it now? And it kind of seems like there are still a number of unanswered questions. And it's something I wanted to come on to you, Maggie, which is around, like, as Neil sort of says, there's some sort of unanswered questions there around what basic income may or may not do. And also, when you're doing a pilot, you're collecting a lot of data about what people are doing, and you could basically be doing a pilot to test different things. Neil mentioned kind of testing what community involvement would look like, how many people would volunteer more or get more involved in their community. I wonder, you kind of wrote the petition, what would you like the pilot to test? What would be the kind of hypotheses that you would like to test it in the pilot, and kind of some of the things that you'd like to focus on? Because there's so many different areas that it could do. So I wondered what you'd like to specifically test through the pilot.
Well, yeah, I think test people's well-being, and the way you can do that is maybe people who might access services for mental health, because most of the trials have shown that people's mental health improves, so there would be less strain on the public purse in Brighton for services which are stretched to breaking point to support people's mental health if they felt more secure. Also, just to come back a little bit to the last point about why a trial in the UK, you know, we're a country that at the moment is quite beleaguered by Brexit. No one can deny this. And yet the response when the COVID crisis happened, when the NHS asked for volunteers, they were swamped, absolutely swamped. And it shows, to my mind, that the British do still have a kind of sense of, you know, fair play. It might have got a little bit lost in all of the political shenanigans, but the sort of sense that everyone deserves a fair chance. And I think something like this would indicate very clearly that everyone is equal. So, but yeah, that was just my other bit I wanted to say. But yeah, people's mental well-being and probably how much they could contribute to their local community, you know, volunteering work at schools or in community gardens or in community centres, which at the moment people try and do. They squeeze that into their long jobs and looking after their families, and that would give them more time to do that. So I think you'd see a big uptake in various community services that could be supported.
Thanks, Maggie. And perhaps Martin and Neil, you might want to come in on that shortly. But I wondered, we've had a question from Paul Chandler, who talks about how perhaps he's heard a lot of presentations about basic income like this evening, and lots of the kind of potential good advantages, and which sometimes may seem fairly obvious when giving some people some financial security. But I suppose the question he has is, well, how would it work? Like, are there any actual calculations that he's seen, he sees as hugely expensive and arguably politically unviable, is kind of linked to that question of what is it that you'd like to test? Would a pilot help answer some of those questions that Paul has there about, well, how would this actually work? Perhaps I can go to Neil first and on that one.
Simply put, yes and no. What a pilot at this scale would be able to answer would be, firstly, the human experience. What does this do for being a human in this society, in this civilization? Second, like, how practically, mechanically might it work? How do people receive? How do people then go about spending? I mean, these kinds of things. Is it going to be an automatic bank transfer? Is it going to be something that you have to go and collect? So just like the basic technicalities. At a meta level, a small scale pilot necessarily isn't going to be able to answer the meta questions of how much is this going to cost in an aggregate. You're only going to know that either by doing it or by forecasting and making macroeconomic calculations. So a pilot can tell us a bunch that is important, but in terms of the aggregate cost and how much we consider that to be worth bearing, those are both speculative questions that you need to be good at maths to answer, and philosophical questions that you need ultimately to have a sense of justice to be able to answer, and a sense of what kind of world you would like to live in, which necessarily, of course, pertains to how we distribute the resources that exist within our society and on our planet. So pilots can't give you that. That's something that, unfortunately, I think goes well beyond the domain of a pilot.
And kind of a question linked to that linked to Paul's, goes to Martin and Maggie. I just wonder if, have you thought about, the practicalities of how much the basic income would be in the pilot, and how much it might cost? Because I think that kind of would begin to answer at least some of those questions that Paul raises. Go to Martin and then Maggie on that one.
Yeah, I think Neil's completely right with the idea that trials can tell you about the sort of stories. It's very good at looking at how it can change people's lives on an individual level, and also the technicalities. I do agree, whether it's a card that they give out or automatic bank transfers. But yeah, it's difficult to know about how you have a big strategy for example, a nationwide basic income. But we have looked into this, and for example, the UBI Lab network, who are great advocates of basic income and have been doing great work over the past year, there was work done by the UBI Lab Sheffield on potential proposals for a trial, and they were suggesting 3 different types of trials, and they did costings for that to understand about how a trial, for example, over a 3 or 4 year length of time would, how much it would cost and what potential benefits that they would expect. So there has been work done on some costings, and it is quite an expensive process, I'm not going to lie about that, and there's a lot of technicalities that need to be addressed, and a lot of these were addressed in the Scottish feasibility study. And if you look at the Scottish feasibility study that was done by, as we say, them 4 councils in Scotland, they're pooled together to form the Citizens Basic Income Network in Scotland. And you can read the report online if you go onto their website. They talk about how it's a very difficult process, and really we need the national government on board to get involved with the DWP and changing people's welfare around and how we tax people. So it's a difficult process. It's certainly not easy in terms of trials, but to get to that level of what a national strategy could be, there is think tanks which have come up with proposals, and most of them vary from sort of around about £50 right up to sort of £100, £120 per person per week. and with different amounts for children and different amounts for pensioners. And certainly the Green Party had a proposal, which I said I'll send you, Paul, and you know, because we have chatted before about this, and I have got the spreadsheet which I will send you, so you can have a look at that and scrutinise what that is. And there's various different ways that you can change taxes and you can raise the money, which I'm happy to go into a bit later if we want to go into. But this is more to sort of talk about the trial. But it can work. It is quite costly, but it is affordable if you collect tax in the right way.
Can I just add something to that?
Oh yeah.
Sorry, just agreeing entirely with everything that has just been said. So the World Bank, and particularly a guy called Ugo Gentilini, a World Bank researcher, has done some really interesting simulations of how much basic income would cost in a variety of national political contexts, and also what the sort of social policy trade-offs might be in those given contexts. And it's interesting, and the data are sort of mixed in terms of encouragement. What's, I think, a really critical deficit, if you like, in this work and in a lot of basic income conversations, including some of this, is that we take the tax base as given, which is totally and utterly scandalous in a world of colossal wealth, staggering inequality, and really inefficient and unjust tax collection. So one of the key pieces that for me is missing in all of basic income advocacy and basic income conversation is the pay for it and the inequality piece. The core reality is there's a shite load of money out there that is being stashed away that our governments and other governments are not accessing whilst people are jetting around their yachts in the Caribbean. That money should be used to pay for basic income for citizens like us. That money should be used to pay for greening our economies and for ensuring that we are future climate proof. It's not that the resources don't exist. And if we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of a conversation that takes the existing pot as set, then we've already lost. The reality is the pot can change. And at the moment, so much of what could be in this pot is in a tiny pot that belongs to a tiny number of other people. That needs to be part of this conversation, and that money needs to be back in the public domain.
That's really, really helpful. And Maggie, I'm going to come back to you shortly, but I think because you've mentioned tax there, Neil, a kind of interesting time to bring in Safi Price's point here, where she said, you know, I've always thought that UBI would be paid by increasing taxes, as Neil suggested there, but kind of wondered how this could happen with a localized pilot. Like, are you able, one of the challenges, I guess, is that you're unable potentially to test UBI in its full sense because you're not being able to test the kind of tax implications as well on people. So Neil, I don't know what, I mean, is that just a reality?
It's a necessary limitation of a pilot. Like a pilot will only tell you, as I said before, like what happens in the lives of people, which really, really matters, and matters really to the extent that you are willing to be moved by what happens in the lives of other people, which is true for many politicians, but sadly not for all of them. A pilot can also tell you the mechanics. A pilot necessarily cannot tell you, unless it is globalized across a particular polity, across a particular national space, how exactly it works in terms of the flow of resources. So a pilot in Brighton, a pilot anywhere else is going to have to be paid for probably by some external pot, and then you're going to have to take the results and then build something out from that. But it's too small to be able to tell you how does the entire system change. Only a full system change could tell you that.
And that's really helpful. I hope that somewhat answers your point there, Safi. Coming back to Maggie, Martin there was talking a little bit about, you know, how these pilots might work, kind of drawing on some of the proposals that the Scottish Government have done and the UBI Lab Network. I wondered if you'd had any kind of thoughts about how this might look like in Brighton. Is it going to be, you know, a 3 or a 5 year study, or is it going to be a 6 month or 1 year study? What kind of thing did you have in mind?
It's got to be a year at least, I would think, because it takes a while for people to notice the impact on something. Probably 2 or 3 years, I would think. Also, I mean, this kind of fear about how to pay for it, as Neil says, yes, it's going to have to come from an external pot because there's no way a council could administer the money we're talking about. But people kind of forget the fact that the money that people get in basic income, they're not going to be stashing it under the bed or in cupboards. They're going out and spending it in the local economy. So it puts back what comes out. It's just a case of rejigging who gets the money, because the amount of money that's on unearned income, such as rent or inheritance, is scandalous. As Neil says, we need to put this back. We need to redistribute it more fairly. So yeah, I'm not sure how a pilot exactly works, but it's a leap of faith, I think, is that we say we need this because we need to do better. Because at the moment we're not doing well. A lot of people are struggling mentally, financially, and something's got to change for them.
Absolutely, and I suppose the design of pilots are ultimately up to politicians like Martin and academics like Neil, who can kind of go away and do that policy work. But ultimately, it's something that's clearly needed. And Maggie, I want to stay with you because Nina Taylor had a question about how do you think the trial would contribute to people's abilities to keep families together? Is that something that you mentioned was quite interested in testing? Can you just share a little bit more about that, if you could?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it would help hugely, because at the moment, there's this kind of compulsion that everyone must be in a job, even if, as David Graeber, the late David Graeber said, there's so many bullshit jobs. There's jobs that don't need to happen. So when you consider there's a family with a young child, they have to put the child into full-time childcare and both work long hours in order to pay for the childcare. And you just think that this is crazy. Children are an important part of the fabric of society. They need to be raised by their parents, by other people as well. But this kind of compulsion to sort of separate family and work life when it should all be part of one thing. So there should be, I think it would help enormously with fluidity, so people could, do their paid employment in a more part-time capacity. They'd have more time to spend with their family, and they'd have more time to create activities for other families in the area, and there'd be a greater sense of community.
So if that's the potential impact on families, as the kind of thinking would go, Nina also had a question for Martin, which was about the fact that the council has now declared themselves an anti-racist city. Is this something that that could be looked into in the pilot as well? As we know, austerity, Nina says, creates a fertile ground for racism. Could basic income be a concrete contribution to helping Brighton become an anti-racist city? Is that something that you can see a link there? And is that, if so, is that something that you could see being kind of built into the pilot in some way?
Yeah, I think racial justice is something that economic justice could address. And if you give money, different communities have not had a great say and certainly not had a great experience. And if you look at all the studies of BME communities and different people they don't have as good a representation and a good say and a good contribution to the economy as some of the other groups of people who are maybe controlling the ideas. So having them linked in is certainly important and powerful. But also I think it's a bigger say about it's sort of looking at the how you link people in and say that everyone is the same in terms of the eyes of a government or the eyes of a council who are distributing it. Because if everyone is given the same amount of money, no matter who they are or their background, then it does equal out, and I think it's encourages more sort of a progressive and a fairer type of politics. So I think that is certainly a part of it, and there's a whole mix of other things that we haven't mentioned, like climate justice as well, and various things that certainly affect BME communities, for example, more disproportionately than others. So yeah, definitely it's something that could be incorporated in a trial. You could even talk about, there's a big conversation about reparations and whether you sort of give money to communities who have been affected by the sort of the history of the British Empire, etc. But I like to think of basic income as almost a reparations for all, effectively, that you're sharing out the wealth of the economy that's been gathered over the sort of centuries and over the years, and then distributing that out into an individual level, so that individuals can then decide about what they want to do. So it's just, yeah, it's certainly a policy which is fairer, and something which narrows the gap that's there in terms of gender gaps and racial inequality gaps.
Yeah, and I point Nina and others to some of the work that's being done in the United States, where universal basic income is really seen often through a racial justice lens, partly dating back to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement that talked a lot about a guaranteed income, but that's also partly the kind of energy that's around basic income in the United States is now around that theme. So it's worth checking out some of the work that's being done there. I wanted to come to Neil, kind of linked to that last question is, to what extent are there any other kind of community observations that have come out in some of the pilots that have taken place elsewhere? I'm thinking of like India, the kind of impact that it had on kind of relationships within the villages and the towns, even the impact on it that it had on gender relations and kind of exploitation in those spaces. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about that, if that's something that we might be able to see here.
Absolutely, very, very, very happy to. So, I mean, some of the most important, probably arguably the most important finding, at least in my opinion, out of the Indian pilot that took place was sort of the, in inverted commas, the emancipatory premium of a basic income. This is basically the term that the researchers involved used. So in other words, it's not just that like the basic income was really good for everybody pretty much across the domain in terms of improved health, in terms of greater access to schooling for young people, in terms of improved nutrition, in terms of greater sort of social and collective participation. All of that is true. But what was particularly interesting is that the positive net effects in each of these domains were higher for those who were previously on the bottom end of the social hierarchy. So for women in relation to men, for people who were less able in relation to those who were able, for those who are sort of old and therefore at the end of the productive spectrum vis-a-vis those who are of working age, and so on and so forth. So just to underline is that the net effect was better and more restorative, if you will, in relation to existing structures of inequality. To take simply the example of gender, lots and lots and lots of the women who were involved reported having greater authority in their home, greater ability to make decisions about the allocation of resources. You know, what do we spend on? Do we send our girl children to school as well as our boy children? Experiencing greater respect, greater senses of self-worth, greater autonomy. Plenty of women came together in cooperatives to set up little micro businesses, for example, or they set up on their own. And that, of course, was also supportive ultimately of their future choices and their ability to make future choices in the context of highly unequal social relations. So there's plenty of encouragement to be taken from that data that the kind of social aspect, if you will, of a basic income will be highly beneficial. Last point I'll add here is around collective action. The basic income trial that took place in India also tested whether or not the positive effect of receiving a basic income was increased, decreased, or didn't change when accompanied with support, in this case by a labour union, or like the Self-Employed Women's Association. It's a collective, very large collective of women, poor women who work in the informal economy in India, and has done lots and lots of sort of community mobilization work up and down the land. And what they found is that, again, the impact of accompanying a basic income with this kind of like counseling, support for collective action, awareness raising, so on and so forth, this accompaniment increased the positive net effect of simply receiving cash. So I think what that tells us, and certainly this needs to be explored in other settings as well, is obviously that money matters, which it inevitably would in a capitalist society, but that money plus is better. And again, that to me is particularly encouraging for the design of a pilot, and a pilot in particular in a place like Brighton, where such kind of social or collective accompaniments would not be terribly difficult to organise.
Thank you, and kind of a good, all three of your answers there kind of begin to kind of add texture to kind of what some of the results that we could see or what we could test for. But I want to bring it back to a couple of questions around, the question of like some of the practicalities and how we might pay for this. So one for Martin, I think, is Another one from Paul, which is the suggestion that the government would fund the proposed pilot in Brighton. I suppose linked to that question is, presumably Brighton and Hove Council, like many councils around the country, very cash strapped. Presumably this wouldn't be paid for by the council. Would you just be able to kind of clarify that?
Yeah, so the main ask would be to ask for the national government to fund a trial. Yeah, we wouldn't be wanting to fund it ourselves. Some of these trials would end up being tens of millions of pounds for 3 or 4 years of basis, and the council's got roughly around 750 million pounds per year is their sort of revenue, and that's how much that they can spend. So yeah, we wouldn't be doing this ourselves. We would be asking the national government to fund it. So yeah, that's just sort of the basic answer, really. It's not something that we would want to be funding on a local basis, or having there's ideas of ways that you can have local taxation, but the government's very centralised, and it doesn't even give us the powers to even do that, even if we wanted to. There's been sort of articles that I've read about, you could have, for example, like a local income tax almost, and you could levy different types of money in a different way, but that is, that's not even on the cards. So we're limited by our power. So it's mainly devolved powers that are, if the economy is devolved to, like, for example, as it is in Scotland, or in some extent in Wales or in the London Assembly, or if you've got maybe a metro mayor, which we don't have in Brighton and Hove, then maybe they would be better places to contemplate or consider the idea of raising money locally. So yeah, we wouldn't be doing that ourselves, but there is other ideas that even if we didn't raise the money ourselves for the trial, then, and even if the government were to reject our calls, so as part of the petition, we wanted to write a letter to the government. So even if they did knock back that, which is probably expected, is the way that they've been going, they've been knocking back all of the other calls for support. But we could explore things like sort of micro trials or demonstrations of basic income, which could look at more of the stories based. So you've got the stories and the technical side of it, as Neil's described on trials. And if you had a demonstration of, say, maybe 100 people or something in Brighton that you could pick out who could then be given a basic income, that could be funded on a more local basis, because that's much more affordable in terms of how much money we would need to spend. So that's a potential that we could go forward to, but this is what the council would have to look into. And one of my asks next week is for the council to set up a members working group to look into some of these proposals, and to lobby and to continue lobbying going forward.
That's really helpful, and it's good you point out at the end, yeah, the kind of different types of pilots you can have. And I suppose one of the other routes is in philanthropic funding and different charities and grants and foundations that can contribute to something, perhaps on the micro size that you mentioned there. Sherry made a point in the chat about the importance of joining forces. She mentioned the Robin Hood tax campaign, but Lewis Small kind of mentioned the kind of focus on needing to build the political support. I wonder if, firstly, Maggie, if you could share a little bit about some of the support that you've been able to build in Brighton, some of the other organisations who are interested in this, or if you haven't been able to build that yet, who are the other organisations that you want to, whatever happens next Thursday, who are the other kind of types of organisations that you want to start to build relationships with over the next few weeks and months? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, Brighton's got a thriving voluntary and community sector. So there's, some 200 organisations that cover the whole breadth of sort of health and social care. There's RISE, which is a charity for women suffering domestic abuse, because that's not been mentioned here, but for a lot of women who are in domestic violence situations, a basic income will be their only get out clause to be able to escape and be in a place of safety. There's very many charities that deal with people with addictions, disabilities. There's probably about 200 at least organisations, so all of those I think would be good people to partner with. There's a very active local Extinction Rebellion here, because that's something else we've not touched on, but obviously the climate impact that could be improved by basic income. So yeah, there's a lot of support. We did a little event about 10 days ago, just meeting people on the level, chatting to them, and pretty much everyone I spoke to, certainly, if they hadn't heard of it, once they had it explained to them, said, well, this makes sense. Why don't we do this? This is a much better idea. So I think there would be a massive groundswell of support for it.
Great. So I'm conscious of time. It's 6:25, and we want to get everyone off at 6:30. So I'm going to kind of begin to wrap up now, and I hear kind of final reflections from the panel. I'm going to go in reverse order as we started. So Neil, I wonder if you had any kind of closing remarks, and particularly kind of Maggie's there talked a little bit about the kind of in Brighton, the kind of groups that are emerging in coalition around this. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more of an international flavour of where you see, not just in Brighton, but some of the energy for this coming around across the UK and globally. Like what kind of actors and stakeholders are interested in this?
Sure, thank you. Look, before that, first things first, if you'll pardon the pun, I want to emphasise that basic income and addressing massive inequality, redistributing wealth, are two sides of the same coin. We really, 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 really need to start making that case clear. Ultimately, those who hold social and economic power quickly stymie the basic income conversation by asking the question, how's it going to get paid for? That very question assumes that the current distribution of resources is given, but it can't be, and it shouldn't be, and it needs to be challenged. So for me, a vital step forward in political strategy around basic income thinking has to be making links with those who are campaigning against runaway inequality, who are campaigning against the pooling of ever increasing amounts of resources in ever fewer hands, because that's ultimately what this is about. Basic income is about putting money in the hands of the vast majority of people who don't have enough to get by in a money-based civilization. The reason they don't have enough money to get by is because a tiny number of very powerful people have absolutely shitloads of it. It really is that simple, however much we wish to dress it up in macroeconomic theory. So where I want to see us go is creating links with, for example, social justice organizations like the likes of Oxfam, who very, very effectively highlight inequality, highlight concentrations of wealth. I think there are stirrings of this happening internationally, and those are places I would like to see us take the conversation forward. But also I would think sort of more social forces that perhaps might not be traditional, particularly in places like Brighton, religious organizations. Like the reality is that one of the great international progressives these days is the Pope. And the Pope has come out repeatedly calling for economic justice and wealth redistribution. Basic income is written all over that. I could go on, but I won't. And I'll just leave that call for uniting these two pieces.
Thank you, Neil. Challenge there, I think, for Basic Income Brighton and Basic Income South East to reach out to the religious community and some of those other organisations Neil mentioned. Martin, I'll come to you. I just want to get a sense of what's next. So how can people view, keep up to date with what happens next Thursday in the council chamber? And you mentioned a little bit about what you hope to come from it in terms of the working group, and share a little bit about what comes next. And then Maggie, I'll come to you and think about how people can get involved.
Yeah, so there is still time to sign the petition, but next Thursday is the full council meeting, and that's when Maggie will be presenting the petition. So you can watch the webcast. So the council meeting starts at 4 or 4:30 next week. So you can tune in by going onto the Brighton Hove council website and watching the webcast. We are going to edit that, I think, and then share it afterwards. So if you don't want to watch the whole webcast, then you can just tune in afterwards. But that's what's going to happen. The petition's going to call for us to is asking for us to write to the government to express that Brighton and Hove wants to have a trial, and asking for feasibility studies to be done. But then I'm also going to extend the asks in my personal asks on behalf of the Green Group of Councillors to ask for this working group. And then I'm hoping to bring this working group together of interested councillors and also include Basic Income South East, who we co-founded, myself, Maggie and Richard, and bring them in, as well as trying to reach out to these other voluntary groups and community sector and religious organisations and all these groups that Neil and Maggie have mentioned, and bring them together to try and come up with a proposal which we can then bring back to the council. So if you wanted to get involved, then you can contact Basic Income South East, or you can contact myself. I think things that's been put in the chat has been the sort of the Twitter handles that we've got, and also our email address. So if you are interested in getting involved, please do. We do host regular meetings, and many of these will be online going forward because we can't meet live, but when we can meet live again, we will be doing so. And so going forward, please do get involved, please contact us, and then watch out for the results of the debate that's going to happen next week at the council.
Thank you, Martin. I mean, Maggie, I was going to ask you about how to get involved, but Martin's kind of stolen your thunder there. But any last reflections from you and how people can get involved?
Okay. So yeah, as Martin's given the reasons to get involved locally, I just want to, if you'll indulge me, it's slightly off topic in that it didn't happen in Brighton, but it does happen in Brighton all the time. It was just someone tagged me into it today on Twitter. So there was a woman who lost her job 2 weeks ago, and then she was told she was going to have to wait 6 weeks for her first universal credit payment. 2 days later, she was unable to get a food parcel because she couldn't prove she needed it. Yesterday, she committed suicide, leaving behind a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old who are now going to be looked after by strangers. So I would like anyone who is sceptical about this and thinks, how can we afford it, this, that, the other? We can argue until we're blue in the face about banks and buildings and businesses, but what cost is human life? What kind of society do we live in where people are that desperate? And now, how much will it cost the state to look after these 2 orphans? So I think, please consider that. Please sign our petition. If you think we can't afford it, remember the cost of human life, which should be of paramount importance.
Superb. I couldn't put it better myself, so I won't. And thank you everyone this evening for coming, and keep an eye out for what's going to happen next Thursday and beyond. So thanks everyone on YouTube, on Facebook, and who's joined us live in the Zoom this evening. Have a very safe and lovely evening. Take care, everybody.